It is impossible to invoke the name Charles Dickens without summoning an image of towering literary influence, a mythic figure whose fiction is said to pulse with the spirit of the age, and whose name has become shorthand for moral clarity and social conscience. To challenge this orthodoxy is not merely unfashionable, it is, to many, unthinkable. Yet if we are to engage seriously with Dickens, not as an untouchable genius, but as a man with flaws, limitations, and prejudices, then we must confront not only the glories of his imagination, but also the narrowness of his intellect and the pettiness of his moral vision. And nowhere are these deficiencies more sharply on display than in his vitriolic campaign against John Rae. Rae, for those who have been insufficiently inducted into the annals of Arctic exploration, was a Scottish surgeon, surveyor, and explorer of exceptional skill. It was Rae who uncovered the grim fate of the Franklin expedition, that doomed voyage into the Canadian Arctic which had become a national obsession in mid-19th century Britain. Franklin and his men, as Rae reported with unflinching candour, had succumbed not merely to the elements but to the ultimate degradation, starvation so severe that it drove them to cannibalism. Rae's findings, drawn from forensic evidence and Inuit testimony, were beyond credible. They were irrefutable. Yet they were also unpalatable to a nation intent on elevating Franklin into a martyr of imperial ambition, a symbol of the indomitable British spirit. Dickens, for all his vaunted humanity, did not rise to meet the moment with either intellectual rigour or moral courage. Instead, he set his considerable rhetorical powers against Rae, not in the service of truth, but in defence of a brittle national myth. Dickens rejected Rae's account out of hand, dismissing it as slanderous hearsay and assailing the credibility of the Inuit witnesses. In doing so, he revealed an undercurrent of prejudice and chauvinism that should discomfit even his most ardent admirers. For what was this if not a refusal to accept inconvenient facts, because they came from savage mouths, and because they shattered the illusion of British heroism? Consider the gall it must have taken for Dickens, a man with no expertise in exploration, no first-hand knowledge of the Arctic, and no meaningful engagement with Rae's evidence, to so confidently discredit him. Was it ignorance? Surely Dickens, with his immense capacity for research and detail, could not have been entirely unaware of the strength of Rae's case. No, Dickens's objections were not born of ignorance, but of willful blindness, of a refusal to acknowledge a truth that conflicted with his romanticized vision of Franklin and his men as paragons of virtue. In his essay, The Lost Arctic Voyagers, Dickens paints the Inuit as unreliable narrators, dismissing their testimony with the kind of casual racism that betrays not merely the prejudices of his age, but also the limits of his imagination. Dickens, who could imbue fictional paupers and prostitutes with such dignity and complexity, could not extend the same empathy or intellectual curiosity to the Inuit. This is not merely ironic, it is damning. For it shows that Dickens's vaunted humanity was neither universal nor unqualified. It was instead deeply parochial, bounded by race, class, and a sentimental nationalism that blinded him to inconvenient realities. Dickens's attack on Rae also speaks to a deeper intellectual failing, his inability to grapple with ambiguity. Shakespeare, whom Dickens so often and so self-consciously invoked as his spiritual forebear, excelled at exploring the grey areas of human experience, the moral compromises, the competing truths, the tragic inevitabilities. Dickens, by contrast, was too often a moral absolutist, more comfortable dividing the world into heroes and villains than wrestling with its complexities. In his zeal to defend Franklin's honour, Dickens reduced Rae to a caricature, a dishonourable man peddling dishonourable lies. This was not the work of a level-headed thinker, but of a man desperate to preserve the comforting fictions that sustained his world-view. The true tragedy of Dickens's campaign against Rae is that it reveals a man unwilling to confront the darker truths of his time. In rejecting Rae's findings, Dickens was not merely rejecting evidence. He was rejecting the opportunity to grapple with the moral and existential challenges posed by the Franklin expedition's demise. What does it mean, after all, when the civilized men of empire descend into savagery? What does it mean when the supposedly superior culture must rely on the testimony and skills of the uncivilized to piece together its own failures? These are the questions Rae's account forces us to ask, and they are precisely the questions Dickens refused to entertain. In the end, Dickens's attack on Rae does more than tarnish his reputation. It exposes the limitations of his genius. For all his gifts as a storyteller, Dickens was not in the final analysis a thinker of great depth or subtlety. He was, as Orwell astutely observed, a man of fixed and simple ideas, incapable of reconciling his romantic ideals with the harsher truths of human nature. His treatment of Rae, then, is not an aberration but a symptom of this deeper failing. It is the work of a man who could craft unforgettable stories, but who, when faced with the messy complexities of real life, opted for denial over understanding. To call Dickens the Shakespeare of the Victorian age is, therefore, to misunderstand both men. Shakespeare was a poet of ambiguity, a master of the human condition in all its contradictions. Dickens, for all his brilliance, was a moralist, a man who preferred the clear, the certain, and the consoling to the ambiguous, the challenging, and the true. His vilification of John Rae is a testament to this limitation, and it should force us to reconsider the uncritical adulation that so often surrounds his name. Dickens was a great writer, yes, but a wise or level-headed one? Hardly.